Welcome to Afternoon Light, the podcast of the Robert Menzies Institute, hosted by Georgina Downer. Hello, and on today's episode of Afternoon Light, I'm talking to Dr. Brendan Nelson, who served as leader of the Liberal Party of Australia and leader of the opposition between 2007 and 2008. He is currently working at Boeing, and we're talking over Zoom today, and he's in Washington, D.C. So I think it's evening with you and very early morning with me, so it's wonderful to connect on opposite sides of the world, Brendan.
It's always a pleasure to speak to you, Georgina, and thank you very much for the work that you're doing in leading the Menzies Institute. It means a great deal to all of us.
Oh, thank you very much, Brendan. Well, this conversation today is part of this little mini-series we're doing on conversations with the living leaders of the Liberal Party. And we've had wonderful conversations with John Howard, Alexander Downer and Scott Morrison, and we've got others planned, and I've really enjoyed them. Everyone has their own perspective, but I do like to start at the beginning with each of these conversations. How did you come to join Menzies Liberal Party?
Well, I certainly have the most unorthodox to the Liberal Party of any of the leaders, Georgina, and so I'm sure you know. And I grew up in Launceston in northern Tasmania until I was 12, and my family then moved to Adelaide. My father was adopted, and his adopted father was a communist until 1956 and founding member of the Clerks' Union of Australia. So unsurprisingly, my father's politics were deeply rooted in that of the Labor Party and, generally speaking, the left of it. Interestingly, my mother, whose family were devout Irish Catholics, they were Menzian Liberals. But in my family, my mother got the religion, so I was raised a Roman Catholic, which I'm committed, and also then steeped in my father's politics. So I was a member of the Australian Labor Party in my teens and then left it when I approached my late teens. But I had been a Labor voter until 1987. It was the first time I voted for the Liberal Party. I was running 2 medical practices. I had an overdraft. I had a second mortgage on my house. And I realised, in fact, I said to my father that I'd come to learn that life was not as simple as he told me. He said if you cared for working people, you supported the labour movement. And I came to realise that if you really care for working people, you have to give people incentives to get out of bed, to work hard, to take a risk, to create wealth for themselves, their families and the rest of the community. So it was an unorthodox route, but that's how I came to it. And I will very proudly remain a member of the Liberal Party until the day of my death.
It's a very interesting story, and as you say, quite different from all the other leaders of the Liberal Party. But it's the story that reflects how politics worked back then. I don't think it's quite the same these days. You did slightly inherit your parents' political views and voting habits, and I think young people these days just say, well, I don't really care what mum and dad do. I'm doing my own thing. But I think
that's true.
I think, you know, a lot of people were not unquestioning, because I think that's being disrespectful to their point of view, but they came from a Labor family. This is what we do. We have a loyalty to that side of politics. And as you said, your father said, if you're on the side of working people, you vote Labor. That's just what the Nelsons do.
Yeah, that's right, at least on my father's side. And I remember when I was a boy in Launceston, it must have been the Bass by-election, and my father had stickers all over the car, you know, vote Labor, vote for Lance Barnard. And I remember my mother having an argument with him and insisting remove them from the car because it was embarrassing, for a start. And secondly, she actually supported the Liberal Party. So that was one of my early memories. But yeah, generally, Georgina, you're right. In those days, you did pretty much politically what your parents had taught you to do. But look, I went into medicine, and toward the end of my undergraduate medical course, I came up against the class war. And this was in the late 70s, early 80s. And I had people denigrating me because I was coming into the medical profession, which really, really annoyed me and made me angry. And then I also then came up against people like Mark Latham, who was a young Labor firebrand, a fellow called George Gear, who was the member for Canning in Western Australia, and others building a career for themselves on the denigration of the medical profession. So that was putting me in a frame of mind to think, well, what on earth is this class war about against the doctors? And then, as I said, nothing educates you more about life, perhaps other than having children, but when you are responsible for the economic welfare of other human beings. And I was employing at that stage and they were women who did administrative roles and important roles in the after-hours emergency medical practice that I had established with David Crean, Simon Crean's brother, I might add, in Hobart, and another in Launceston. And then we got an ambit claim from the unions. And I realised that these people, these women and the doctors who worked for us, they were relying entirely on the effort that we were making, the sacrifices that we were making. And yes, of course, medical practice is supported by Medicare and so on, but it really does educate you about things. And I then realised very graphically that if you don't work hard, if you don't have people that have an incentive to, as I say, to work hard, get out of bed, take risks, create wealth, then you have nothing. The other thing I learned was that, in fact, in some ways, I remember at my pre-selection in 1995, Georgina, the first question I got from the audience was why. I should explain my Labor background and then coming to the Liberal Party. And tongue-in-cheek, I said, well, yes, my life would have been a lot simpler if my father had run into Robert Menzies when I was a boy. But unfortunately, he didn't. But I also said to them that I wouldn't change it, that I'm a better person in coming to liberalism through my adult life and the journey that I did. I didn't come into the Young Liberals at 14 or 15 or 16 years of age and ever consider anything other than that. And I learned that liberalism is absorbed through familiarity with the idealism and hard work of the everyday Australian. Ours is a movement that's not, nor should be, dominated by people that are wealthy and have significant influence in life, that the heroes of our movement, as I say, are people that often work at very humble occupations, and particularly the sort of people that inspired me most through my privilege to represent the people of Bradfield in the federal parliament, the Liberal Party, and certainly leadership of it.
I'm interested in the influence your mother had. You said she was Menzies fan, a Liberal voter. She was a staunch Catholic. It's interesting in the Menzies history, obviously he makes a very significant policy decision around state aid for Catholic schools and non-government schools, so the federal government providing funding directly to that system so parents could have a choice between the public and the private non-government system. That is said to have really influenced the Catholic community in Australia at a time when sectarianism was pretty rife, to change their voting patterns. And this is a massive generalisation because every individual is an individual. It should not be defined by their religion or identity in general. But in the main, the Catholic communities, particularly the Irish Catholic community, were voting Labor, and there was a shift. Is that something you observed, or was that your mother's experience? How was her community and I guess her family networks, how were they viewing politics back then?
Well, the extent to which I remember it was that my mother and her father, my grandfather, and my grandmother's maiden name, by the way, was Molly Maguire, and she was one of
perfect
7
Irish
children.
Name.
And so very perfect Irish name.
From central casting, really.
Correct, yeah, absolutely. And so, as I recall, they were very anti-communist. They thought that Santa Maria was, I wouldn't say an extremist, but had views that were far beyond what they felt were acceptable, and they were attracted to Menzies' idea that people should be free, they shouldn't be told what to do by other people within reason, and also that support that Menzies gave to initially in those science laboratories and then for the Catholic sector, I think in 62 or 63. That certainly played a role. I went to Christian Brothers College in Launceston. I remember there were 55 kids in my class and we didn't have a library at the school. And I do remember my
class,
mother.
55 kids. That poor teacher.
Yep, that's right.
Oh, my goodness. It was a
that's
brother,
right.
no doubt.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So, yes, that's right. The Christian Brothers, and they certainly had a way of keeping things under control with a strap in methylated spirits on the desk at the front of the classroom.
Ouch.
So I had that more than a few times. But I know that it played a role in my mother's thinking. But my father was very steadfast in his commitment to the Labor Party. But interestingly, though, I do remember my father speaking with admiration of then Senator Neville Bonner. I remember I made a comment as I was a boy, but I saw Andrew Peacock on television, and I made a comment that was sort of critical of him. And my father said to me, "No, son," he said, "there are good people on both sides of politics." He said, "We support the Labor movement, but there are some very good Liberals, and Andrew Peacock is one of them." So my father was one of those sort of people that was able to see good in people who were trying to do the best thing they could for the country.
Well, that's admirable, and I think a quality we'd like everyone to have. But, maybe that also gave you that perspective of seeing the other side too.
Well, one of the keys in life is to be imbued with the imaginative capacity to see the world through the eyes of others. And I find that people who close their mind to new ideas, to thoughts that challenge our inherent biases and prejudices, set themselves up for failure. You have to have a mind that's open to the unfamiliar, to people that are different. In my opinion, that's one of the gifts that Menzies had. Yes, he was committed to traditional liberal ideals, but he was a man who, as I saw it, was very much open to listening to what his opponents had to say. If he saw good people or ideas that he thought would be good for the Liberal Party, he would bring them in. And in fact, coming back to my unorthodox background, I remember Sir John Carrick in 1967 then said to the Liberal Party, he was, as you know, the long-serving, I think 21 years, General Secretary of the New South Wales Divisional Liberal Party. And Sir John was saying to the Liberal Party at the time, I think he was writing in Quadrant, that the challenge was to bring people who were Labor voters into the Liberal Party and bring them over. None of us should lose sight of that. And it's rather interesting in a contemporary context when you think, I think quite rightly, of all the criticism that I attracted when I challenged David Connolly for pre-selection in Bradfield in 1995. Of course, I understand people being immensely critical and excoriating of me, my background, and how unorthodox it was. But here we are today. We have Warren Mundine, who's a former president of the Labor Party, and as we know, ran as a candidate for us in Gilmore and very supportive of the contemporary Liberal cause.
Well, the ultimate example I can think of, and it was a precursor to the Liberal Party, was, of course, Joe Lyons, fellow Tasmanian like yourself, moving from the Labor Party, and I mean not just the Labor Party, leader of the Labor Party, to the UAP and becoming Prime Minister. And the UAP, as you know, goes on to become one of the organisations that become the Liberal Party in 1944. That's an incredible transition from going from Labor politics and senior positions in the Labor movement to leading the opposing side of the centre-right. So it does happen.
Of course. And of course, the first member for Bradfield was Billy Hughes. Not that I want to be compared with him, but and of course, he famously was asked why he hadn't joined the Country Party as it was then, and he said, "Well, you've got to draw a line somewhere." So
yes. Yes, it's funny when you reflect on political history in Australia. I mean, it was still turbulent. It's no different now. And I think people who don't know their history would say, oh, it's never been as bad, or instability and the good old days of stability and two-party politics. Well, I'm sorry, it was pretty unstable. And that was one of the, I guess, the gifts that Menzies gave us was stability.
Well, I often say to people, the Australian Labor Party, of course, has more than a century. The National Party, formerly the Country Party, a very long history. But it wasn't until Sir Robert Menzies brought the Liberal Party into life in 1944 that we really got stability generally in our political class. And you're right about history. A sense of history is absolutely essential to any understanding of the future. And in the most divided our country has ever been was coming out of the First World War. And we were deeply divided around conscription, around religion and politics. And the 1920s was a close run thing. A number of countries in Europe abandoned democracy, and yet we remained true to it at a time when we were just so divided. And it's something to be proud of, to think that we came through it. So very divided period.
Yes, yeah, and it's really important, as you say, to reflect on our history. I am very interested in your time at the AMA. You said you were a doctor managing an after-hours practice with Simon Crean's brother in Tasmania, but then you moved into medical politics to the AMA. It was quite a different organisation, I think, than it's considered now in terms of its political leanings and the issues it champions.
Yes, well, I should give a plug. I published my memoirs and biography late last year. It's called Of Life and of Leadership, and all of the royalties go to Lifeline and Legacy. It's not a money thing for me, but I document, well, my life basically, which includes that period at the AMA. So in 1987, which as I said is the first year I voted Liberal, I voted for John Howard that year, and I was very angry with the federal government. That was the Hawke-Keating government. The treatment of the medical profession, the anti-doctor rhetoric that was emanating from it. And I was also angry with the Australian Medical Association. And so I decided to get active in the AMA. And I was living in Hobart at the time. And I went along to meetings. I was at my third meeting, and I was listening to what I regarded as nonsense coming from the chairman of this meeting. At the time, I was a neurosurgeon. He's a very good man, John Liddell. And there was no discussion about the issues that were really affecting the profession at the time. And I remember getting up and asking, we were getting these anti-doctor headlines that were coming from these politicians and the then Labor government. And anyway, he said to me and to the meeting, he said, look, these politicians, they're a passing parade, they come and go, but we're committed to our profession in the long term. There's no point engaging them on any of this. And I remember sitting down, having basically opposed that point of view, and I turned to the fellow next to me and I said, right, if the last thing I do, I'm going to get wherever I have to get and do whatever I have to do to change this organisation. And I remember he and others said, he and others said to me, oh, you'll never get anywhere, no one will listen to you. The AMA then was a very conservative organisation. I had a number 2, had all my hair cut off basically, I had an earring, had a Labor Party background, as I said. I didn't own a suit, but it was pretty simple, Georgina. I thought, well, if you can express yourself well in a democratic organisation and you have a valid argument to prosecute, then surely you must be able to make a difference. And it was as simple as that. And I threw myself into it. I had no ambition other than to, as I say, change the organisation. I wasn't seeking high office in it. And one thing led to the next. Through a confluence of events, I discovered that the presidency of the Tasmanian branch of the AMA was up for election, that they'd only ever choose one candidate. They'd put one candidate's name on a ballot paper. They'd send it out to the voters who'd all vote for the one candidate on the paper. And I was on a reform agenda, and I basically got a couple of friends of mine to nominate me to run for president. I was 29 years of age.
Oh, wow.
And that really upset the establishment. They tried to talk me out of it, and that flushed out 2 more candidates. Anyway, I wrote to all of the members of the AMA, who were all voters in Tasmania at the time, and I said, this is my vision for the organisation, this is what we need to do in order to achieve it, this is where we're failing our patients, let alone ourselves, and so on. And then they tried to censure me because I was critical of the leadership of the AMA at the time. And I went to my first annual general meeting on a Saturday afternoon in 1989 in Hobart at the AMA headquarters, and they counted all the votes and announced that I was the winner. So I immediately went out and hired a dinner suit to go to my first AMA dinner. But what I discovered, Georgina, I realised how power can be used in certain ways to give effect to the ambitions of people that don't have any. And I'd got active in the AMA because I was concerned about professional, industrial issues and health financing. But I learned how power, in this case the power of the medical profession, could be used to challenge and change the attitudes of society on a whole range of issues that have an impact on health. So I've always worked hard, but when you're running 2 medical practices and you're president of the AMA, that was at the state level, it's hard work. And then I met Dr. Bruce Shepherd, who was described in the British Medical Journal as an avuncular ultra-right-wing orthopaedic surgeon, which always offended Bruce because he thought he was much more right-wing than that. So,
and where was he from?
Where
was he from?
He was from Sydney. He was an orthopaedic surgeon who had famously or infamously led all the specialists out of the New South Wales public hospitals in the mid-80s, and it was over a matter of principle. They wanted to treat their private patients in the public hospitals, but in return treat all public patients for nothing. And Bruce Shepherd subsequently told him, Bruce Shepherd subsequently told me that when he first met Neville Wran, who was then the Premier of New South Wales, that Wran said to him, "Dr. Shepherd, you represent the last independent group in society, and as such I move to control you." But for me, in 1989, Bruce Shepherd was an anathema to what I was on about, and he'd come to Hobart. He was travelling the country raising money for a fighting fund to fight the federal government. And I went along to this event, and then a friend of mine said to me afterwards, "Oh, come and I'll introduce you to Bruce." And I said, "Well, that wouldn't be a good idea." So anyway, he took me up and I said hello to Bruce Shepherd, and I said, "How do you do, Dr. Shepherd? You represent everything in the medical profession I don't like. You've given us a particularly bad name. And as far as I'm concerned, I'm on a reform agenda with the AMA, and I'm going to do everything I can to marginalise you and people like you."
Wow.
And
okay.
I was a very brash young man, and he looked at me and I thought he'd say two words to me, the first of which would be "get." Instead of that, he said, "I've been watching you." He said, "You're going to go a long way, and the medical profession desperately needs people like you." He said, "When you get to know me, then tell me what you think about me, but you'll find we've got more in common than you think." He said, "By the way, the first piece of advice I'm going to give you is never pass an opinion on someone you haven't met." And I was disarmed by that.
I bet,
and Anyway, we went off and had dinner and we became good friends. He became a mentor. He gave me a lot of advice, some of which I took. So that basically put me on my path into the federal politics of the AMA.
So you become president of the AMA. One of the things you were a strong advocate for was private health insurance, which, I mean, in contemporary sense, people don't think too much about it. Having lived in the United Kingdom and the United States, I mean, I have, and you've obviously have too, or you've at least worked in both countries, you get a flavour of other countries' health systems. And I must say, having ageing family in the British health system, I'm very happy to live in Australia. I think hybrid system where we have a bit of a private system that people use and can access, that, you know, middle class people can quite easily, and then a public system so that absolutely no one lacks medical attention that they need, is a fantastic mix. And it's quintessentially, I think, Australian. It's egalitarian, but it recognises that, no, if you can pay, you should pay, but if you can't, we're there to support you. That system has been challenged over the years, and I think it's really a classic Menzies system too, where it really reaches into that sense that Australians generous but also independent, and that we want our choices, and we want to make sure that we provide for everyone in the community, but also if you can bear a bit of the burden, so be it. That's good.
It is, and we have a universal healthcare system now, Medicare, and wars have been fought over Medicare politically in the mainstream political parties, and the AMA fought against universal bulk billing, the idea that everybody just walks around with a credit card and walks in and sees a doctor whenever they want and pays nothing. But that has now ended. I mean, I remember Graham Richardson, when he was the health minister appointed after the 1993 election, he said to me, "Mate, Australians have voted for Medicare 5 times in a row. What's it going to take to get it through to you guys?" And so obviously I remember that. But it's interesting. I remember on the 13th of October, 1992, I was the federal vice president of the AMA, and the health minister and deputy prime minister in the Labor government was Brian Howe. And I had a meeting with Brian Howe. And one of my patients in Hobart was a woman called Athol Guy, and she was the president of the Tasmanian Pensioners Union. She was as Labor as they come. Chain smoking, tough. She'd had a hard life. And I was seeing her the day before I was flying to Canberra to see Brian Howe. And I said, "Ethel," I said, "as you know, I go to Canberra a bit and I see the heavies." I said, "I'm going to see the health minister on Friday. Is there anything you'd like me to tell him?" She said, "Well, my members are going without food to pay their private health insurance premiums." She said, "Could you please beg him to do something to help us with our private health insurance?" So anyway, I get to Canberra, I have this meeting with Brian Howe, 13th of October, as I say, 1992. I said this to him, and he said, "Brendan, you don't get it, do you?" And I said, "I'm sorry, Minister, what do you mean?" He said, "You don't get it." He said, "If you want to change anything this government's doing, you'll have to change the government." So I thought the arrogance of the man. Yeah, I know. I thought the arrogance of the man, and I've been a minister, as you know, I would never think that, let alone say it to anyone. So I left the meeting that day and I thought, right, if that's what it takes, that's what I'm going to try and do. So Bruce Shepherd needed no convincing. He was then the federal president. And we went really hard to support the Liberal Party in the 93 election. We actually worked with Bob Woods in writing health policy. And I remember saying to Howe and others that at that time there were 600,000 aged pensioners in Australia with private health insurance. And they had Paul Keating, who at the time was reported to be worth $5 million, speaking from the Royal Adelaide Hospital, saying people were, and I quote, wasting their money with private health insurance. They should do what I do and use Medicare, end of quote. So there were lots of fights around it, but our system is a good one. It's not without fault, and anyone who's on a waiting list in the public system knows entirely what I'm talking about. But the government provides assistance for people to get their private health insurance now, to keep it. That gives people choice. It also reduces demand on the public system, for which we all pay through our taxes and Medicare levy. But yeah, if you think there's a problem with the Australian healthcare system, try getting sick in another country.
Absolutely. You enter Parliament as a member for Bradfield in 1996, and you did describe your pre-selection battle. And I mean, look, every pre-selection battle is hotly contested for those types of seats, and rightly so. It's a good, I guess, filtering system. If you have to go through that, you can probably cope with the real deal in the Parliament and beyond. And you were really soon promoted by Prime Minister John Howard, who was the new Prime Minister in 1996, to Education Minister, which would have been quite a different portfolio for you. But you did some very significant things while you were there.
Well, thanks, Georgina. I wasn't promoted that quickly. Actually, I was a backbencher for 5.5 years.
Oh, well, that's not too bad. Some people wait 10, 15.
I know. Well, Malcolm Fraser, I think, was one of them. And it's interesting, later in my political career, John Howard apologised to me for holding me back so long. And I said to him, no, I'm a better person and I was a better minister for the time that I spent on the back bench. And that's certainly the case. So the first I learned that it was Peter Reith, supported by Sir John Carrick, who encouraged John Howard to appoint me as the Parliamentary Secretary for Defence in 2001 and the junior minister. And I thoroughly enjoyed that job. And then following the 2001 election, John Howard called me and asked me if I would go into Cabinet as Minister for Education, Science and Training. And by the way, in that phone call that he made to me, he said, Brendan, while I'm speaking to you, there's a couple of things I'd like to say. And I said, yes, Prime Minister. He said, well, after the 1998 election, he said, you would have noticed that a couple of your colleagues in New South Wales got promoted and you didn't. And I said, yes, I did. And that was Joe Hockey and Tony Abbott. He said, I gave you the worst job I've ever given anybody. He said, I put you in charge of running noise abatement and flight paths at Sydney Airport. And I said, yes. And he said, you must have hated that job. And I said, yes. He said, what I admire about you is that no one knew. He said, you just threw yourself into it. You did the best job you possibly could. He said, I've had a few disappointments in my political career, which is an understatement. He said, how people deal with them says a lot more about them than how they deal with success. And then the second thing he said to me, he said, I want you to come into Cabinet, but he said, I want you to bring your views with you. He said, you and I have different views on a number of issues, and I want the Cabinet to hear them. He said, don't be intimidated out of saying what you really think. And therein were 2 lessons in leadership. But yeah, so I was privileged to be Minister for Education, Science and Training for 4.5 years. And when I say I, it was me, my staff, the senior people in the department, supported by the Prime Minister, obviously, in driving a lot of reform in universities, a reform in schools, major changes in science, major funding for science programs. And I thoroughly enjoyed the job. One of the things I learned when I was president of the AMA, we used to bemoan the fact we couldn't get a health minister that actually knew anything about health. And we had a passing parade of people with different skills, abilities and so on. But I learned that the minister's job is not to be an expert, perhaps other than Attorney General. The key task is the application of intellectual rigour to the process of exercising judgment. And you draw on all the expertise that you have within your department and outside the department in the broader community. And that's your job. Your role is to effectively represent the good judgment of the everyday person who's relying upon you to do the right thing and look after their taxes. But yeah, I really enjoyed that job.
I was at university when you were education minister, and I remember all too well those massive fights and protests on campus around voluntary student unionism. And of course, this is something that you took on as an issue. And as the Robert Menzies Institute, obviously based at Melbourne University, which is the university I attended, we now have voluntary student unionism. I don't think the young folk these days would realise that you had a choice. But, I mean, tell me about that battle, because that was a significant one.
Well, after I was appointed to the portfolio late in 2001, within a month, I determined that there needed to be major reform in the university sector to introduce some deregulation, to introduce innovative funding models, a whole range of reforms. And I remember saying to the Young Liberal Movement and the Liberal Students' Federation, I said, look, if I try to take on voluntary student unionism with broader reforms in the sector, then VSU is going to contaminate a much broader societal need for reform. And they were outstanding. The ALSF and the Young Liberals, they understood it. And I said, but once I'm through this major reform, hopefully I get it through. But if I don't, I said, once we're done with this, then I will take on VSU. I said, that's my solemn oath to you. So we got through a 2-year and innovative process. I finally got the reforms through, an $11 billion reform package for higher education, through a hostile Senate, I might add. And then I said to them, right, it's VSU. So I remember going to see John Howard in his office, and I said, Prime Minister, I made a promise to the Young Liberals and the ALSF to take on VSU. I just want to check that you're prepared to invest some political capital in this before I embark on this journey. And John Howard said to me, yep, we've believed in it for too long. Let's do it. So we did, and it was a close-run thing. We had a majority in the Senate at the time, but as Peter Costello said, on a good day, because Barnaby Joyce was then a National Party senator and was very much a free thinker, shall I say. Mm-hmm. So unfortunately, unfortunately, Barnaby decided that he was not going to support VSU. But Senator Stephen Fielding, who was a Family First senator from Victoria, he would not declare his position on it. And I remember I had the legislation, had gone through the reps, we had it in the Senate, and in the last sitting week of the year in 2005, I remember Robert Hill was the leader in the Senate. We didn't have the numbers to guarantee its passage in the Senate. And Senator Fielding had told me that he would not be part of any deals. He wouldn't declare his position on VSU. He said, if you put it into the Senate, you'll find out what I think about it. And interestingly, in a masterstroke, I shouldn't say that because it sounds conceited, I said to my Chief of Staff, well, let's have a look at his maiden speech. What did Senator Fielding say in his first speech? Why did he come to the Senate? So I looked at a range of things, which included a medical campus in Gippsland, a number of other family-related initiatives. And so I went and saw Senator Fielding and I said, we're interested in establishing a medical campus in Gippsland, running a drug education program through the universities and a whole range of things. And I took him to see John Howard, and John Howard had a discussion with him and assured him that we would do the things that I said we would. And Senator Fielding said, well, that's very nice, but I don't do any deals. And interestingly, Barnaby Joyce had an amendment that he wanted put to the Senate in relation to the VSU legislation. And so I said to Barnaby, I said, well, if you want your amendment considered, then please vote with us on all procedural motions so we can then have your amendment put. And he said, yes, that's great. What he didn't know at the time was that Fielding had told me that he would not support any procedural motions at all. So John Howard called Robert Hill round to his office and said to Robert, he said, well, Brendan wants to put the legislation into the Senate. And Robert said, no, we're not going to put anything in unless we know the outcome. And I said to John Howard, well, my gut feeling is that Fielding will vote for us, and I think we should test it on the floor. And Howard said to Hill, he said, I'm going to go with Brendan's judgment. We'll do it. So Fielding voted against us on all procedural motions while Barnaby voted for us. We got to Barnaby's amendment and then Fielding voted with us to vote it down. And then on the very last vote, Fielding walks into the chamber as the bells ring, the doors close, and then he sits with us and it went through.
Wow.
It was democracy in action, Georgina.
Yeah, amazing. Yeah.
Most exciting day. I've never seen Mrs. Howard so excited as when I went to the Prime Minister's office and that legislation was passed.
The wins in politics make all the losses worthwhile, don't they? Before I get to your time as Leader of the Opposition, Leader of the Liberal Party, I did want to ask you about your time as Minister for Defence, and that was from 2006 to 2007. I mean, defence is always a difficult portfolio. I mean, in my lifetime, every defence minister has grappled with massive issues. And of course, as our strategic environment has evolved over the decades, defence, has had to do a lot of crystal ball gazing about the long-term decisions that need to be made in order to address the challenges to our territory, but also further afield. As the Defence Minister, you made some pretty key decisions on the purchase of Hornet jets, and that was one of those controversial defence procurement decisions. Can you give us a perspective on how you managed such a decision? And I guess especially with the issues around AUKUS and the recent Defence Strategic Review, which will again challenge the Defence Minister and the Defence establishment to really make the right decisions in response to the circumstances of not just today, but of 10, 15, 20 years' time.
Well, I mentioned earlier that your key task is the application of intellectual rigour to the process of exercising judgment. One of the things that I've learned about experts, and the Defence Department is full of them, uniformed and not uniformed, is they tend to see the world through a straw. And as the Minister, you obviously do everything you can to get across detail, to understand the issues, but you bring, and you should bring, a broader context and perspective to the decisions that are being made. The day that John Howard rang me in January 2006 and asked me to be Minister for Defence, if he'd said to me, can you have a look at the F-35, the Joint Strike Fighter, and tell me if we're doing the right thing, I would have said, I'm sorry, Prime Minister, I have no idea what you're talking about. Within 3 months, I had discovered a lot of problems in the development of Australia's air combat capability. And within 7 months of the Prime Minister first calling me, I was confident enough that we had a problem coming, that Defence was denying, that I actually went to the Prime Minister in the absence of Defence leadership and said to him, we have a problem. This is what I recommend we do. We have 4 options. I put them to him. I gave him my preferred option. He said, work it up and bring it to Cabinet. And when the announcement was made that we would buy 24 Super Hornets, there was no one in Defence that would publicly support the decision. With the passage of time, it's been proven to be one of the best decisions that the Howard government made. The advice I give to all ministers, gratuitous advice, and certainly to Defence ministers, is to follow your instincts. And you are there to exercise judgment, and you've got all this expertise, you've got all these people who've spent a lifetime committed to defence, to strategic policy and all of those things, and in most cases they are right, but sometimes they are not. And there's a groupthink that can be particularly dangerous. And that's why we elect people to exercise judgment for us. So we're now living through the most complex operating environment in our lifetime, the most consequential geopolitical realignment in our lifetime. More than ever, we need to invest in defence capability, and we also need decisions made that are very much in our national interest and not governed in any way by domestic politics.
Huge challenges. It must have been an enormous challenge to make a decision and then have the defence establishment, not one person, come out in support of it. That takes a huge amount of bravery. And, well, as you said, we're the beneficiaries of your strong decision-making there. You became leader of the Liberal Party after the 2007 election loss, and you, of course, had entered the Parliament with the 1996 election win. So you had never experienced opposition. And I mean, I can speak from a family experience. I know my father entered Parliament in 1984 and had 12 very long years in opposition. I mean, he didn't know anything other than opposition, and opposition is tough. How did that manifest itself to you, having been Defence Minister, in charge of the department, in charge of the big decisions, part of cabinet, then to go to leading a party that certainly wasn't wiped out. It was not that devastating an election. But, I mean, you lost your leader. John Howard lost his seat. So he was out of the parliament and you were facing quite a different set of circumstances. I mean, a lot of the people in the party room would have been like you, would never have experienced opposition before.
It was a very, very difficult time. And it's well known that Malcolm Turnbull wanted to be the leader of the party, that Peter Costello shocked us all the day after the election by saying he wouldn't seek or accept the leadership of the party. I had seriously contemplated running for deputy and was reasonably confident that I would be able to win that. And then Malcolm immediately nominated to be leader. I spent 24 hours thinking about it, talking to a whole bunch of people, and I decided that at that time it needed a particular style of leadership that would be able to deal with the grief and mourning that we had about loss of office. We'd lost John Howard. We'd effectively lose Peter Costello. We'd lost Mark Vaile. We would lose Alexander Downer, who had decided to leave the parliament. I think we had a 7-seat deficit on the government. So Kevin Rudd had won, but it had not been a landslide. And we lost for 3 reasons, Georgina. One was longevity. A woman in a focus group in Mayo in December 2006, she said, and I quote, "I respect Mr. Howard, but I'm over him. I want to change." And the second reason we lost was
brutal,
overreach
isn't it? It really is brutal.
It is, and I likened
just sort of
it
sick
to
in your face, but nothing really wrong with you except just tired of you. I mean, what can you do?
Yeah.
What can you do?
I likened it to putting down a much-loved family pet. And and then the second reason was overreach on work choices, and the third was we were monstered on the symbolism around climate change. But I felt very strongly that we needed to embrace the Howard legacy, recognise why we had lost, and within a month or so I was convinced from my interactions with Kevin Rudd that he was not the real deal. And I said to my leadership group, I said, this is going to turn. And when it does, it's going to turn very quickly. And it'll be like, I said to them, if you've bought a Holden every year for 11 years and you agonise over it and buy a Ford, it won't be till you find the 10th defect you'll put your arms up in the air and say, my wife was right, I should have stuck with a Holden. But at that time, there weren't a lot of people that wanted to listen to that. But that's how it was. So, yeah, I kept drawing again on Robert Menzies, the vision for the party, the key things that he'd said about us. I thought it was important that we never lose sight of who we are and what it is we believe, to steadfastly, as I say, hold on to the essentials of that Howard legacy, not to jettison those things. And I remember I was opposition leader, and it was 6:30 in the morning, and I'd stopped at Sutton Forest to get at McDonald's on my way to Canberra with a couple of my staff. And I'm standing in the queue, and there's a big television screen behind the staff serving us, and it had the news poll, and it said preferred Prime Minister Kevin Rudd 75%, and I was like 11% or something. And a man behind me said to me, he said, "Brendan, don't worry about any of that stuff." He said, "We just voted Rudd in." He said, "Just because we like him doesn't mean we dislike you." He said, "But I'll tell you one thing about this government." He said, "I think it's going to be like the set of a Western movie where they've got all these facades with sticks holding them up at the back."
Oh, wow.
And I thought, what a prescient assessment that was. But it was an extremely difficult time. But in the context of what happened in Aston recently, it's worth remembering we held Mayo. We had 11 candidates in the field. And then we had a 6% swing to us in Gippsland. So I remember John Howard ringing me from London, very excited, the night of the Gippsland by-election. He said, "Brendan, there's something happening." I said to him, yes, because we'd built a narrative around ALCO, POPs, tax and climate change and fuel excise and other things. So, yeah, it was a very difficult period. And, of course, the ambitions of Malcolm Turnbull were unbridled. So I'll leave it at that.
Yes, indeed. I wondered if we could finish off our discussion with the apology and I guess how it's evolved Indigenous policy and the debates around the representation of Indigenous people in our constitution have evolved to today. Can you give me some reflections on that?
So we had lost government. So in the last 2 years we were in office, the backbench was increasingly frustrated because they couldn't express their views in the interest of discipline. There was immense pressure for people not to dissent from the decisions being made and so on and so forth. So we come out of government, we come into opposition, I become the leader. Kevin Rudd says the first item for business when the new parliament would sit, would be a formal apology to the forcibly removed generations of Aboriginal children. So I wanted to make sure that our members, our parliamentary members, had their day in court, that they had their opportunity to say what they thought about this, to not have their position imposed upon them by the leadership. What I did was I made sure that the people opposing the apology knew that their views were understood by me. And what I would say is publicly, I'd say, well, I'd ask the question, no, should our generation be held responsible for the decisions made by earlier generations of Australians, whether they're decisions about which we feel pride or whether they're ones about which we feel shame? Can we actually apologise for, if you like, for the sins of our fathers? And I was determined that there would be a party room meeting at which the issue would be ventilated, debated, and following the party room meeting, the party would adopt a position. There would not be a free vote on it. And I bled on this for the best part of 7 weeks because I would not lock the party into supporting or opposing the apology. One of the things, Georgina, and this is in the context of this constitutional referendum we have now, what's really important, whether you support this case, the change of the Constitution, or whether you oppose it, what's really important on these really big issues is that people feel they've had their day in court. Their views have been heard. And the last thing that I was going to do was to simply lock the party into saying, right, we're going to apologise. So when we got to the party room meeting, I stood in front of them. I put the arguments in support of an apology to them. I put the arguments against an apology to them, and then strongly recommended we support the apology, firstly for moral reasons and secondly for political reasons. We had a 4-hour debate, and at the end of it, Bill Heffernan, the farmer, larger-than-life senator from New South Wales, he got up and said to the party room, I'm proud of a lot of yous. It's the best meeting I've ever attended.
Oh, wow.
And I said to the party room at the end of that meeting, I said, when I get up to give my speech, every one of you will hear an element of what's important to you. And after the apology and a reception that was held in the members' hall, I remember one of our very conservative Liberal Party members who'd never liked me, never supported me. She grabbed me by the elbow and she said, Brendan, thank you for upholding our dignity. And I can't tell you how much that meant to me, because what she meant by that was, I didn't get my way, is what she's saying. You haven't done what I wanted, but you understood and respected my point of view and have given people like me dignity in supporting the apology. So it was very difficult, but we're a better Australia for having supported it.
In today's climate, we're debating the voice, and there hasn't been a constitutional convention. There's been a parliamentary committee which has concluded its hearings now and will deliver a report. It is a very divisive debate, and I mean, obviously Peter Dutton has made a decision, the Liberal Party's made a decision, but there is some leakage evidently around the edges. Some Liberal Party members are going to support the voice as the Prime Minister is proposing it, and that obviously goes against the proposal and the policy position of Peter Dutton and the Liberal Party. How do you think the voice debate has been conducted in Australia? And I guess I'd be interested in your view on it too, on the voice.
Well, look, firstly, I'm the president of Boeing Global. I oversee Boeing's international operations throughout the world, and I'm not really in a position to ventilate a personal opinion on the referendum itself. I'd make the observation that the reluctance of Australians to change the Constitution is exceeded only by their reluctance to read it. And
yes.
People should
it is quite
people
boring.
Should ask themselves.
It's very technocratic.
Yes, that's right. So people should ask themselves, do I know what the Constitution is? Do I know what role it plays in the democracy within which I live and the society whose freedoms that too often I take for granted? So that's the first thing to ask. And then secondly, if the referendum is passed, what will that mean for the governance of my country? And if it's not passed, what will that equally mean for the governance of my country? Personally, I think whatever the referendum is, in this case it's the formal recognition of Indigenous Australians and giving them a voice to the Parliament, the executive, the government, but whatever the referenda questions that we've had put throughout our history since Federation, there needs to be an understanding of what the arguments are in support of it and what the arguments are against it. and what the consequences of it being passed will be. That's the responsibility that I think we all have, and I'm not going to comment on the process that we've had in this particular referendum question, Georgina, nor give people gratuitous advice about how they should vote.
Understood. Well, Brendan Nelson, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me and give our listeners on Afternoon Light the opportunity to hear from one of the Liberal Party leaders. I think it's been a fabulous discussion, and I really appreciate the time you've taken on the other side of the world.
It's absolutely my pleasure, Georgina. I always love talking to you anytime. Thank you.
Thank you. That's it for this week's episode of Afternoon Light, the podcast of the Robert Menzies Institute. Please make sure to subscribe and catch up on our latest online content on our website or on Twitter, LinkedIn or Facebook.